started. So firstly, welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here. For those I haven't said hello to tonight, particularly on this hot evening, come on in. And welcome you all. Before we start, I'll introduce myself. I think everyone knows me, Andrew Stobart. There's a few new faces in the audience tonight, and also Chloe, my stepdaughter, Chloe Merbis. And we're going to start with an acknowledgement of country. We want to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation and the lands we're meeting on here tonight, and pay our respects to the elders past and present. So tonight is a bit of a replay of what we did 5 years ago. On that occasion it was with Annika, my daughter, and this time I'm very pleased to see Chloe here also. And I really felt that it was time to do this again, because over those 5 years, things haven't progressed anywhere near as much as we would have liked for it to have progressed. There's been some progress, but clearly not enough. It also coincides with a global event, which my dear friend Al Gore will explain in a moment, which has been conducted all around the world by climate reality leaders, of which I am one, in presenting these presentations in many places around the world, and particularly in the US. The reason I also wanted to do it was, as a baby boomer and a child of the post-war fossil fuel era, I carry a fair bit of responsibility for where we are today, and the consequences of what's happened since the war. And you'll see through the presentation tonight this incredible economic expansion that the world has enjoyed for most of the Western world in any case, and the consequences of that in terms of the environmental impact which it's caused. So I feel a great deal of responsibility for having enjoyed that and wanting to see what we can do about the future, so we don't have to continue in that direction in respect of doing that damage. I'm also sad about what has happened and what we observe in the environment today, and angry as well about the lack of responsiveness from our governments in responding to this challenge. So that was the motivation for me wanting to do it tonight, to bring you all along, if you like, on the journey and what needs to be done to address the issues of climate change. Chloe?
And for me, it was a really amazing opportunity to have my voice in it, as I've always had such a passion and love for nature, the world, and planets, animals and plants who share it. And I feel it's more of a feeling of responsibility as well. It's not so much of a conscious choice, but this real emotion within me of being like, okay, like I need to learn about this. I need to see what we can do, how we can preserve what we have here. And especially with people around my age at the moment, it's becoming quite a prevalent thing to talk about. And so, yeah, it was a great opportunity to learn and share with everyone what we've also thought was important.
Yeah. So tonight we're going to cover the topic as well as we possibly can. You'd appreciate it's a very broad topic. It's a very diverse topic. There's lots of dimensions to this, and but it's important we touch on some of the key issues. So we won't be going into depth in every single one. I could stand here for hours and talk to you about all the issues surrounding the climate crisis, but we won't be able to do that tonight. But I expect that by the end of the evening you will hopefully leave more informed than what you are today, what you are tonight, and that you will feel empowered to carry the conversation forward after tonight and achieve change in your own networks. I also, as a consequence of this topic, I know that most of you are all, well, if not all well-read people, and many of you already have a reasonable knowledge about the issues of climate change. And so, we'll be touching on things that you're already very familiar with, and perhaps you even know a lot more about it than me. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. So apologies in advance for teaching you things that you already know. The information that we'll be presenting tonight all comes from proper research scientific sources. some of which has been supplied by Climate Reality and some of which has been supplied through my own research together with Chloe. So I can assure you that it's based on scientific data. It's not opinion from some individual who wants to publish a story in the Herald Sun, but something based on science. In terms of timing, it's going to be about an hour and a quarter of presentation in 3 parts. We're going to have a couple of little activities midway through the presentation, and then we'll have some questions and discussion at the end, and I think that's about it. So the aim is to finish at about 9 o'clock tonight. I also apologise for the fact that we will be moving reasonably quickly, because it's always this trade-off of, how much do you say and how quickly do you go, because there is a lot to be said, and but I don't want to keep you here any longer than I promised. So as a consequence, we will be moving fairly fast through the presentation.
You guys will be fine though.
So before we start, a little bit of an activity. I'd like to do a little bit of a show of hands amongst us all here tonight. For those of you who saw Australia Talks, I think it was on Monday night, you would have seen that on the ABC, a very interesting program. If you haven't seen it, have a look at it on iView. That 84% of the Australian population believe in climate change and believe that action should be taken to address climate change, which was a very refreshing number to hear. Very surprising, very refreshing. And even when you dice and slice that statistic through the country by geography, by age, by political persuasion, that biased it a little bit. Where you were in the country, rural or urban, the 84% or thereabouts was pretty consistent. So it's not just by the lunatic latte-sipping lefties in Melbourne that believe in climate change, but also those ones out there in the bush fighting the fires. So I'm not going to ask you that question, but I'm going to ask you a couple of others instead. And the first one is, how many of us here tonight are confused by the science of climate change and the impacts that it's having? How many of us, how many of us are not confused? How many of us feel very confident about that? Confident? Yes? This is the confident show of hands about, that's good. That's about half of us here tonight. That's great. Helps us gauge the presentation. This is a more difficult one. How many of us here tonight believe that if the climate crisis is not addressed and addressed aggressively, then the survival of the species, including humans, is potentially threatened? How many of us would believe that tonight? Wow, that's a big number. Okay. I don't think there's any need to do this presentation anymore. Okay. Someone said, oh, you're preaching to the converted. I said, yeah, but how much does the converted know? And you obviously know a lot. The third question is, how many of us think that the actions that the governments around the country are taking today is sufficient to deal with the issues of climate change? Nobody. Well, that's not surprising. That's great, and that's great to hear, because there is a lot more to be done. So let's get into it. How are we going for time? What time is it? I haven't got a clock in front of me. There it is. I'm 3 minutes behind time. Behind schedule coming in. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Al for a moment, and he'll tell you a little bit more about this evening.
Hello, everyone. I'm Al Gore, founder and chairman of the Climate Reality Project. Thank you so much for joining us for 24 hours of reality, truth in action, a global day of action to help solve the climate crisis. If you're watching this right now, you're taking part in a global climate conversation that's happening right now. You are about to see one of 20,000 climate reality leaders from all around the world who is about to lay out the truth as the scientists spell it out about the climate crisis and the solutions that are now at hand. Also, that presenter is going to emphasize the need for swift and bold action. I have personally trained each one of these leaders because we know that one of the best ways to get people to take action is when they hear the message through direct face-to-face engagements in local communities. I believe it's people just like you who can and will make the difference in solving this crisis. So I hope you will find the information being presented very interesting. I hope you learn some new facts, and I hope you're inspired. And most of all, I want to challenge you to continue the conversation after the presentation with those in your own family, in your business, in your school, in your community, in your social organization. Please help spread the word and fight as if your world depends on it, because after all, it does depend on it.
Okay, we're going to kick off with this slide. It's just a bit of an emotion setter, if you like. A beautiful picture of the Earth taken right back in 1972. It's referred to as the blue marble. It was one of the first pictures taken of the entire Earth, the full circle of the Earth at the time. Very clearly see the South Pole, Antarctica pictured there as well. Of course, the Earth is the only planet in our solar system that has life on it like the life that we enjoy. And the reason for that is because of the atmosphere that surrounds us. So the themes tonight are going to be: must we change, can we change, and will we change? And this image here is of the sun rising above the horizon and showing two layers of the atmosphere, the troposphere and the stratosphere. The troposphere being the lowest and the stratosphere being above that, and of course there's a number of other layers in the atmosphere as well, but they're the two major ones. The troposphere contains about 80% of the mass of the atmosphere, and that includes the major gas, which is nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, oxygen, and other smaller trace elements of gas, as well as dust and as well as water vapour. And water vapour is actually a greenhouse gas as well. Being a greenhouse gas is not bad in itself. In fact, that's very important. But water vapour often gets neglected as a very important greenhouse gas as well. Now, the atmosphere is very thin. People describe it as a varnish over the Earth. In fact, the troposphere component of the atmosphere, you can drive through that in about 10 minutes at highway speed. It varies. Obviously, there's no clear defining lines between the troposphere and stratosphere and other levels in the atmosphere, but it's about 10 to 15 kilometres. We look up into the sky and we think there's this endless space above us, but it's not endless. It's only 10 kilometres. And then when you look at the Earth and what we've done to the Earth in the last 50 or so years, the transformation that we've taken the Earth through in land and the seas and the rivers and the city construction, and you think, well, if all that transformation occurred in the atmosphere, what would it look like? It's just that we can't see it, the transformation that's actually occurred. But it has occurred just like it's occurred on Earth. So what is the key basics of climate science? Well, solar radiation comes from the sun, we all know that. It comes through in the form of visible light, and it passes through as visible light, and it passes through the atmosphere uninterrupted. The atmosphere is invisible to the light. It then is absorbed on the Earth's surface, in the oceans and in the land. About half of the radiation that comes from the sun is absorbed by the oceans and by the land. The other half is reflected back from the Earth. And some of it goes straight out into space. About 25% of that energy goes straight out into space. And when it's reflected back as infrared energy. So it comes out as light. The visible light is very short wavelength radiation. Infrared radiation is a longer wavelength radiation. And in fact, if you take a photo of the Earth with an infrared camera, which has been done, you just see like the Earth as a red glow because it's always emitting this infrared radiation. So about 25% goes straight out, and the other 25% stays within the atmosphere. And the reason it stays within the atmosphere is because of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that's a great thing. It's what keeps us alive. So the greenhouse gases, being water vapour, CO2, methane, they actually absorb the energy, the infrared radiation, and also emit it. So they absorb it and emit it. And it bounces around inside that troposphere layer and goes back to the Earth. So the Earth receives more energy from the sun than actually comes from the sun itself, because it gets exchanged like that through the troposphere. And that's a great thing. So the atmosphere acts like this blanket around us and keeps us warm, keeps us comfortable, enables life on Earth through the gases that we breathe in oxygen, the gases which are absorbed by plant life in CO2 for photosynthesis. And it keeps the Earth on a stable temperature, which is an average of about 15 degrees centigrade across all of the world throughout the entire year, an average of 15 degrees centigrade. But at the moment, we're spewing all of this man-made CO2 into the atmosphere that we never used to spew 50 so years ago. It's coming from all sorts of sources. It's coming from the burning of coal and oil and gas for the generation of electricity. It's coming from land transport. It's coming from industrial processes. It's coming from agriculture. It's coming from the burning of forests to create agricultural land. And they're probably the major sources in terms of man's activities. So we are actually emitting about 100 million tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere every day, 100 million tonnes across the Earth from human-sourced CO2. And this is what it looks like over the last 150 years or so. This is quite an incredible graph, because we see prior to the war around here, yes, we were emitting CO2 through the burning of coal for the generation of electricity and in industrial uses. But it's been this incredible economic expansion that's occurred after the war and the population expansion that's been associated with it, which has created this incredible acceleration in the emission of CO2 into the atmosphere. And the population associated with that, and post-war the population was 2.2 billion people. Today the population of the Earth is approaching 8 billion people. So we've had all this infrastructure associated with that increased population generating this massive increase in CO2 which has been emitted into the atmosphere. So this slide shows the carbon cycle. And this is a natural process that occurs and has occurred ever since life has been on Earth. Remembering that man's been on Earth for 250,000 years, but Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. So we've only been here a very, very short time. So in the carbon cycle, we have this exchange. We have this exchange of carbon coming down from the atmosphere and being absorbed by the ocean and by the land, and then carbon also being emitted. So the oceans are emitting carbon through the activity of the ocean, and the land is emitting carbon through CO2 through its natural respiration and ventilation processes. Interestingly, you might see, is that the amount of carbon that is being absorbed by the ocean and by the land is in excess of what's being emitted, to the tune of about 17 gigatons, a gigaton being 1,000 million tonne per annum. So the Earth is absorbing more than it's emitting. That's also a good thing, because we've got this little baby over here, the emission of fossil fuels, which started, as you saw on the graph, started about 150 years ago, but it really got ahead of steam post-war. So the 29 gigatons being emitted by the burning of fossil fuels, half of that roughly is being absorbed by the Earth. Now that's a good thing in the short term, but not so great in the long term, because it leads to ocean acidification, and Chloe will talk about that later on. So there's a short-term cycle and there's a long-term cycle as the carbon comes in and then is released over time. And we are talking thousands of years over time. Now, if we stop today emitting carbon in the atmosphere, climate change will continue, temperatures will continue to rise, oceans will continue to heat up. But over about a period of about 20,000 years, that additional carbon dioxide which has been absorbed by the oceans will then be released again into the atmosphere. So how do we know that climate change is a result of human activity? What's the scientific proof of that? Well, there's a number. There's a number which you can read up here, which scientists refer to as fingerprints, as evidence that the CO2 in the atmosphere is emitted by man, and it is CO2 which is causing global warming. In terms of the presence of CO2, we can actually trace the presence of CO2 in the atmosphere because CO2 burnt by fossil fuels has a particular characteristic. It can be identified. It has a particular isotope, if you want to talk in the chemical terms. It's a particular isotope of carbon dioxide. So you can actually trace it. You can go into the atmosphere and measure the carbon dioxide emitted by fossil fuels. You can go into the plants, you can go into the ocean. You can actually trace it and measure it. So that's one very powerful measure that the CO2 that's in the atmosphere is coming from fossil fuels and other sources as well, but 80% is coming from fossil fuels. There's other interesting phenomena too. For example, days are warming faster than nights. So we know temperatures are going up in the atmosphere, but I'm sorry, the other way around. Nights are warming faster than days. So, and winters are warming faster than summers. So because we've got this CO2 blanket around us, we're getting this sort of equalisation in temperature, just like it would be on Venus if we lived on Venus, which we couldn't because it's 100 degrees centigrade, but it's entirely enveloped by carbon dioxide and the temperature is constant. So that's another marker or a fingerprint of the role of man-made CO2 emissions. There are a number of others, and they're listed here. One interesting one, which it took me a while to get my head around, was I mentioned how the atmosphere acts as this blanket. Well, if you put a blanket over yourselves, if you're cold and you put a blanket over yourselves, you warm up underneath the blanket. But what happens to the air above the blanket is it actually gets colder because it's not receiving the heat from underneath anymore. And this is what's happening in the atmosphere. The atmosphere close to us is heating up. The atmosphere further away from us, above the troposphere, is actually cooling down. Now, it can only be greenhouse gases which meet all of these observations that scientists are making in space. Climate denialists will like to talk about natural variability, and I'll come to that as well shortly also. The role of the sun, the role of volcanoes. None of those can explain the observations that scientists are making about what's going on in the atmosphere against these climate drivers. So this is what's happening. We're getting this emission of carbon dioxide, which has rapidly accelerated since the 20th century. And we're getting these increased concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. And of course, if the land and the oceans weren't absorbing that CO2 that I mentioned, then the concentrations in the atmosphere would be much higher. Now, the science of greenhouse science has been known for 100, 150 years. I mean, we can all do the experiments ourselves. There's no doubt about how greenhouse gases cause warming. The question is about climate change. And the opinion on climate change, as far as scientists are concerned, is unequivocal. It's been known for over 20 years. Margaret Thatcher gave a speech to Parliament many, many years ago about the dangers of climate change. This is known science. 97% of scientists confirm that climate change and global warming which leads to climate change, is being caused by human activity. And all of the papers that were researched, over 12,000 papers on this subject, 97.1% of them were indisputable that it was CO2. It is man-made CO2, which is the source of global warming and hence climate change. You will hear some others with opinions. This is peer-reviewed science, evidence-based, scrutinised by peers. 80 national academies of science around the world confirm that the need for urgent action to address climate change is now indisputable. The academies of science in all the major Western countries and others. So now let's have a little look at going right back into history. We're going to go back 6 ice ages. Over the last 800,000 years, scientists are able to determine what actually happened through that period of 800,000 years of 6 ice ages. And they can do that by a number of proxy means. So obviously they can't measure the temperature, but they can measure what the temperature would have been based on their observation of the chemistry. And they do that by drilling cores into the ice, mainly in Antarctica. I don't know if you know, but I was pretty surprised to hear just the other day that the depth of the ice in Antarctica is varies, but it's between 20 and 30 kilometres. Well, scientists have actually been able to drill right down and extract ice cores as deep as 3.5 kilometres. And doing that, they can examine those ice cores and they can examine the trapped air in those ice cores and measure the concentration of CO2. And they can date it. They can also measure the concentration of other gases, and the relative proportion of those gases in that trapped air determines what the temperature is. So two really important things about this graph. First is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has typically varied between 180 and 280 parts per million over those 6 ice ages. And when it has varied from 180 to 280, it's happened over a period of 100,000 years, 100,000 years. Today, and I'll jump a couple of slides ahead, I'll push the right button. This one next shows the correlation of temperature, which I've just mentioned. But today, this is where we're at today. Today we're at 415 parts per million. So scientists have not been able to measure in the last approximately 1 million years what the concentration of carbon was, a concentration of carbon anywhere near what we're experiencing today. The frightening thing is that if we stay on the current trajectory that we're on by continuing to emit carbon dioxide, this is where we're going to end up. This is the trajectory we're on today of 600 parts per million. Now, I don't think anybody knows what life on Earth would be like with a concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of 600 parts per million. Scientists can project that and speculate about that, but really it's uncharted territory. Welcome. Surprise. So let's compress this time period a little bit, and then let's look over the last 120 years. And this graph's a little bit hard to get your head around, sorry about that, but this is an anomaly graph. So an anomaly graph, what it does, it compares what the temperature was at a point in time to the average temperature over the period in which it's being examined. So you look over the average temperature from 1880 to 2020 and you arrive at a number and you say, okay, what was the temperature in 1880 compared to that average? And obviously it was lower. And as you get closer to current day, the temperature gets higher. So this has been the movement. And since about the turn of the century, we haven't had to use proxies. We've used weather stations, thousands and thousands of weather stations located all around the world, on land and on sea, for accurate measurements. And not just one weather station in one location, weather stations adjacent to it to ensure that the measurements can be triangulated and confirmed to be accurate. So we've seen this incredible acceleration, and it depends on when people talk about the temperature increase, they all talk about different comparisons, compared to 1900, compared to the Industrial Revolution this year versus last year. But it's around about 0.8 to 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature since the beginning of the 20th century is the temperature increase that we've experienced so far. And 18 of the last 20 years have actually been the hottest years on record. The hottest years on record, 18 of the 20 years. And even worse, the last 5 years have been the hottest. And who knows what 2019 will be, remains to be seen. So I think the evidence is pretty clear about the relationship of CO2 and global warming and the relationship that it has with climate change and temperature increase. And we are experiencing today incredible increases in temperature. Just earlier in southern Australia, a new record of 49.4 degrees. And not only in summer, but we're experiencing these record temperatures in winter, we're experiencing them in summer as well. Adelaide, 42 degrees today. And in 2018, 224 locations around the world had all-time heat records. Now we're going to move to the North Pole. And this is an image of the North Pole and two important slabs of ice, if you want to call it like that. The Arctic Circle and Greenland. So this is the Arctic Circle, and this is sea ice. So this is ice which is floating on the water. It doesn't play a role at all in sea level rise because it's already in the water. This is Greenland, and this is ice on land. This does play a role in terms of sea level. The significance of this ice, as well as other glaciers all around the world, in countries all over the world, and also Antarctica, is the reflection of the sun from these ice bodies. They play a very important role in reflecting that sun back into the atmosphere and keeping the Earth cool. As that body of ice contracts, obviously less sun is reflected. And in the case of ice which is over water, the water absorbs the sun's rays instead of being reflected. The temperature of the water increases. So you get this positive feedback loop happening as atmospheric temperature increases, ice melts. As ice melts, more water is exposed and absorbs that solar radiation. Consequently, the water heats up, the oceans heat up, and the ice melts even further. Apart from the problem the polar bears have on the Arctic Circle, because they rely on the Arctic Circle and sea ice for their hunting grounds. Greenland is a different situation, or has a different role. It's important in terms of reflecting the sun. And this is, I forgot to mention, the distribution of temperature around the world is not even. The increase is not even. Depends on where you are. Turns out the North Pole, the rate of increase in temperature in the North Pole is about twice as fast as it is elsewhere in the world. And as a consequence of that, the temperatures are rising much faster. The South Pole is opposite. It's not increasing that much at all. And you're getting heat waves in winter, or what's called winter heat waves. The end of winter in 2018, the temperature on the North Pole was actually 28 degrees higher than normal. And in fact, the North Pole had heat waves in the last winter heat waves in the last 3 years. So this is the effect of the sea ice reducing. In the last 30 years, Arctic sea ice cover has reduced by 40%. A real problem for polar bears and a real problem for climate change. In Greenland, this is a slide which I've already mentioned, I jumped ahead. In Greenland, in Greenland, this is a river being formed by melting ice on Greenland. Now, normally, the atmosphere prior to man's activity was in balance. Now, as I mentioned earlier, carbon in equals carbon out. It was in balance. What's happening now is that whole natural process has been completely disrupted. And Greenland was in balance as well. Ice melted on its extremities, at the extremities of Greenland, but snow fell and snow formed ice. And that was happening at pretty much the same rate. So there was no net loss of ice from Greenland. Today, there is a net loss of ice, and it's equivalent in volume to the equivalent of Mount Everest every year of net loss of ice on Greenland. That is a source of sea level rise. Interestingly and surprisingly, scientists have actually never really considered sea level rise as a consequence of melting ice. They've considered it as a consequence of expanding oceans, because as water heats up, it expands and takes up greater space. And that has been, until now, the major source of sea level rise, which has been around about 20 centimetres. Now, we've got the effect of melting ice caps. And as I said, Greenland, 1 Everest per year. This will be, along with thermal expansion of the oceans, this will now be a major player in the future sea level rises. And you get these phenomena where huskies are not pulling sleds along snow, they're pulling them along water above the ice. And that shot was just taken this year in the summer of Greenland. So, melting ice until date has only been about 1/3 of the cause of sea level rise. But if Greenland were to melt entirely, and that's not out of a possibility, then sea level would rise by 6 metres. And this is not an impossible scenario. from the complete melting of Greenland. I mean, it's not going to happen in the next 100 years, but it can happen in the future. So the major cause of sea level rise has been thermal expansion of the oceans. Each 1 degree temperature causes a sea level rise of between 20 and 60 centimetres, and it depends on where you are. So each 1 degree up, the oceans are going up. And to date, they've increased by about 20 centimetres on average. And it's expected, based on current science, that sea levels will increase by about 1 metre by the end of this century, 1 metre. So that's why cities and countries are now talking about adaptation, seawalls and what have you, to stop the water. But you can only stop it to a certain extent. And these are the cities in the world that are going to be most impacted by climate change. As soon as 2070, these cities will be suffering from severe flooding due to sea level rise. The most populous cities in the world. And it's estimated about 200 million people face immediate danger from sea level rise. In terms of asset value, the value of the cities, it's a different story. You've got Miami right up there, Guangzhou, New York. New York already suffers from severe flooding. Miami already suffers from severe flooding. Another 1 metre is a completely different story. So that's it, the first stage of the first part of the presentation. We're going to have a short activity now. Going to enlist Chloe's help, I think, aren't I? And we're going to ask you all to stand up and have a look under your seat.
For a dot of a certain colour, I think they're gold or blue. Green. Gold and green.
To get the excuse me, while you're doing that. Do you want to get it up? Okay, everybody found their dot, or who's got one if they haven't? Everyone can sit down now. And for those who have got a gold dot, who's found a gold dot? Mill, Linda, anybody else got a gold dot? Only 2 so far? Okay, that's okay. We'll find someone else who's got we'll nominate someone else who's got a gold dot in a moment. Got a couple of quizzes for you. Linda, would you like to volunteer to be the first? Sure. So, the atmosphere acts like a blanket, protecting us and making life on Earth possible. The greenhouse effect is the heating up of the planet because we are planting too many trees, the absorption of the sun rays because we have too many houses with green roofs, or the absorption of infrared radiation by the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Which one would you choose, Melinda? There is a prize at stake here, so think carefully.
I think it must be C.
Must be C? Okay, I think you might be right. That's great. Where are the gifts, Liza? There you go. Fantastic. Congratulations. Who else had... Mill, you had one, didn't you? Gold. Okay, this one's for you, Mill. Over the past 1 million years, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has been between about 180 and 280 parts per million. This has changed typically over a period of 100,000 years. Today, it is unchanged, has reached 400 parts per million, or has dropped because the ozone layer has created a hole for it all to escape. Which would you think would be the correct one? B? Okay, you got it. Another present for you. Congratulations, Mill. Who would like to answer the third question? You can see it now. Who's confident to have a go at the third question? Any volunteers?
I get a prize. Who's got the third dot?
We haven't found it.
It is definitely on a chair.
Yeah, but someone hasn't sat on it.
Just check the empty chairs.
No,
Doesn't matter. Anyone.
Doesn't matter. Volunteer for the third question. Come on, it's got to be a volunteer for the third question. You just did it. Mim, go. So, I'll read it out first. Sea level rise is a consequence of the thermal expansion of the oceans and melting glaciers due to the warming oceans and atmosphere. In the future, sea levels will rise further by up to 1 metre as ocean warming is locked in and create tens of millions of climate refugees, will stop if we stop emitting greenhouse gases today, or drop because the evaporation in the atmosphere will increase due to global warming?
I think A.
Think A? You got it. Well done, Mim. Another gift. Congratulations. Now I'd like to hand over to Chloe.
Cool. So we'll be talking about oceans for a bit. Our oceans absorb majority of the extra heat energy trapped by greenhouse gases. We're talking about 93% to be exact. This warming disrupts the major role oceans play in regulating our global temperatures. Majority of the heat is held at the surface level, shown in blue, light blue, but we now see that it's also penetrating 2,000 metres deep and more. Half of this increase in heat content has been just in the last 20 years. Now, one of the many consequences of warmer oceans and excessive nutrients is something called deoxygenation. In the last 50 years, we have seen oxygen-starved waters grow to the size of 1/3 of India. Not only does this beautiful ocean of ours provide us and others a habitat, the habitat for marine creatures, and support communities that rely on it for food resources, but it also plays a critical role as a carbon sink. Oceans have absorbed 23% of human-caused CO2 emissions. This has increased the acidity of the oceans and has a significant impact on marine life and shellfish, marine vertebrates and shellfish. Another consequence of increasing temperatures is increased moisture content in the air. With each 1 degree increase we have in the atmospheric temperature, there is a 7% increase in capacity for the atmosphere to hold water vapour. So this means we have this massive amount of water kind of sitting up that has to then be released. What we see as a result is flooding, extreme weather, and what scientists refer to as these rain bombs, which is quite an amazing image. As the world gets warmer and extra heat increases evaporation, it intensifies the water cycle. These one-time downpour events are becoming more frequent and ferocious. The consequence of this can be supercell typhoons and the catastrophic damage that they cause. In 2013, Typhoon Haiyan brought massive destruction. 4 million climate refugees, thousands dead, and thousands of homes destroyed, hitting the Philippines, Palau, Vietnam, and China. Shown here by a satellite image was Cyclone Debbie, a Category 4 storm over the coast of Queensland, costing $2 billion in damage. So we'll just go back to rain bombs. This graph shows the dramatic increase in record-breaking precipitation extremes. Of particular note is the incredible increase in just the last 20 years, as we see. Last year, the effects were seen in Queensland, where in 24 hours we saw 409 millimetres. These are events occurring more frequently and with greater intensity, even though overall we are seeing less rainfall in Australia. In June last year, in Japan, more than 1 million people were told to evacuate because of these same rain bombs. And again in Japan last October, Typhoon Hagibis, where 800,000 were advised to evacuate and 45 million were advised to move to a secure building or higher grounds. With the sea level rising, these storm surges become higher. In Tokyo Bay, during this particular typhoon, surges were in excess of 1 metre. The Japanese Meteorological Agency issued a level 5 warning, its highest. And now, here's a video. Oh. Maybe it will play.
And returning now to the continuing flood disaster in Bundaberg, and up to 2,000 people have been evacuated as the river reaches the biggest peak in recorded history.
The timing and the speed of the flood was quite astronomical. We were hit very, very quickly with very little warnings, and the rain we had was just unbelievable. I was there to see the helicopters lifting the people off the roofs and all that sort of stuff, the Army coming in and the Air Force coming to help. It was just unbelievable.
I was watching the river at early hours of the morning, different times of the day, to have a look to see. We saw containers, I saw many horses, cattle, pigs, big trees, 12, 15, 20 metres long, flowing down that river. It was causing a lot of damage. The hospital started to get water into its electrical parts in the lower, so that had to be evacuated as well with all the patients.
There's not too many hospitals that have been evacuated. We had to move them from here to the airport, and that required taxis, it required ambulance, and all hands on deck to do that. The town's been quite traumatised by the events. It's had a significant impact on each and every one of us that live in this community.
Now, to shift gears a little bit, the same extra heat that disrupts the water cycle and increases the water vapour evaporated from the ocean also pulls the moisture out of the soil and makes the droughts hit quicker, go deeper, and last a lot longer. We in Australia are very familiar with droughts. The current drought in New South Wales is described as the worst yet. Many of these areas, as with other parts in the world, are used for agriculture, and 1.3 billion people globally rely on agriculture as its main source of income, putting their livelihoods also at risk. And even when these parts do get rain, because the soils have been so dry for so long and a lot of the vegetation has dried up or died, it increases the chance of flooding because it's not able to absorb the water. Cities and countries all over the world are struggling with drought. In May this year, Chennai in India nearly ran out of water. Cities in Australia are suffering the very same problem, hence the construction of desalination plants. Broken Hill this year nearly ran out of water, and its supply is now shifting from the Menindee Lakes to the Murray River. Also suffering from drought, Syria lost more than half of its fertile land, driving 1.5 million people into crowded cities. We can understand why climate change is deemed by experts as a threat multiplier and driver of conflicts. In Syria in 2012, we saw a drought causing a mass movement of people and major civil unrest. This caused a loss of confidence in the government and the ensuing civil conflict which still continues today. Climate change will create the world's largest refugee crisis. Lancet, the most respected health journal, said in their countdown report that the world could see up to 1 billion climate migrants. 1 billion, it's a lot to take in. Now we see wildfires are increasing in size and intensity. Fires are the result of both natural and human events. In this chart, we see the clear correlation between increased temperature and frequency of fires. With increased temperatures and droughts, the vegetation and land, as I spoke about, is a lot drier and therefore more fire prone. Dry lightning strikes also occur more frequently in this weather. And Australia itself is a fire country with dry conditions and endless amount of bush that is filled with gum leaves that are perfect for igniting. Last year in Queensland, the fire danger rating reached catastrophic. We now see with the current fires burning in New South Wales and Queensland that for the first time, Greater Sydney and other parts of New South Wales are breaking these records. And as we've all seen on the news lately, there's just not enough resources to control these fires. And we're seeing a lot of the wildlife and people displaced and everything that's going on there. Whilst Australia is on fire in spring, California is on fire in autumn. The world's largest insurance losses due to fire have occurred in California in each of the last 2 years. Economic losses from extreme weather totaled $653 billion in the US over the past 2 years alone. These extreme weather catastrophes are rapidly increasing worldwide, from typically, on the left, 250 events per year in the 1980s to over 600 in the last decade. On to health. So climate change runs a thin and delicate thread through all these topics here. One crucial to our everyday life being food. The quality, quantity, and where we get our food from is affected. The three most prominent challenges crops face are new pests, expanded ranges for disease, and heat stress. Heat stress is actually reducing the yields of our main crops. These are the projected yield declines for each 1 degree of warming, the highest being corn at a decrease of 7.4%. We also see the increased presence of diseases such as wheat rust, which can wipe out our entire crop. These 4 crops, corn, wheat, rice, and soy, make up 2/3 of our human caloric intake. And rising levels of CO2 are also changing the nutritional value and structure of food grown, which we then consume. It is calculated that the presence of carbon is actually declining the amount of protein and minerals that we have in the food, between 5 and 15%. And it's an oversimplification to say that CO2 is a plant food and therefore good for the environment. Very basically, but it's like saying humans need calcium and therefore ice cream is really good for us. Just providing one of these things without improvement in the others will be of not much benefit. Plants need the right balance of water, temperature, sunlight, and CO2 to grow. They also need to be safe from all the dangers that we're experiencing from extreme weather, like drought, flood, fire, and then not to mention pests. And so, if we're not worrying about the people losing their homes or the diversity of flora and fauna disappearing, then there is the real consequence of climate change for human health to worry about. Again, stated by Lancet, climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. Heat stress alone kills far more people than those that die from fires. Some of you, not myself because I was 3, but remember the heat wave in Europe in 2003, where there was an estimated 70,000 deaths, where the vulnerable communities are at even higher risk. In addition to this, worldwide, air pollution kills approximately 6.5 million people per year. Climate change is disrupting natural ecosystems in a way that is making life better for infectious diseases. Diseases carried by organisms, usually insects, and waterborne diseases are all impacted. The increasing temperature and changing rainfall patterns allow vectors, such as the mosquitoes here, to expand their habitat range, where we see them breeding quicker and maturing faster. Ross River virus, previously restricted to solely northern Queensland, is now present in Victoria. We actually have someone in the audience here tonight who contracted this in Gippsland this year. Likewise, malaria and dengue are expected to be endemic in southern Queensland by 2050. The coverage of Zika virus could double by the end of the century. It seems as though the environment is getting better for diseases and not as much for us. As we know, not only are humans affected. The disruption of natural ecosystems, alongside other factors like land degradation, habitat loss, and the use of fertilisers and other chemicals, is threatening the survival of all species in all parts of the world. World Wildlife Foundation report in 2015 found the population of marine vertebrates has declined by 49% on average in the last 40 plus years. This is due to habitat destruction again, fishery exploitation, and climate change. And let's talk about the sea turtles. As with other animals who lay eggs in the sand, rising temperatures can disrupt their natural reproduction. Increasing sand temperatures can affect the hatchling sex, where eggs in a warmer temperature will become females. Now, this won't create an ocean run by women, but an ocean without genetic diversity. You can see the real threat that poses. We have seen in Australia the destruction of the iconic Great Barrier Reef, which has declined by 50% since the 1980s. This is significantly due to coral bleaching caused by prolonged high temperatures in the ocean. The amount of ocean that coral covers is minute. It's only 1%. And you can imagine that in the whole scale of things. And this 1% supports directly or indirectly 30% of fish. And you may have seen this scary headline on a lot of websites, but it's true. The UN said that we now risk losing up to 1 million of all species in the coming decades due to these multiple factors: habitat loss, pollution, and climate change, where one day we may only be able to see these beautiful creatures watching an episode of David Attenborough. Although small in size, we know that insects are a fundamental building block of life. However, they're also in danger. 40% of all insect species are in decline and 33% are endangered. You get the general trajectory. If the current rate of decline continues, they could vanish within a century. And I'll let you read this yourselves. We'll pause this for a second and go to another set of activities. Give you guys a breather. And so the people with the other dots, I can't remember what colour they were, can you put up your hands so I know? Green. Okay, so 2 tentative hands. Is there a third? Yeah. Well, maybe you can answer this one first. So we know that food crops are impacted by climate change, and I think you can gather it is caused by loss of nutrients and minerals, increased pest diseases, declining yields, or all of the above. Oh, well, you got yourself a prize. My shoe's broken in my excitement. And for you, the next one, increasing atmospheric temperature is causing increased extreme weather events. In the last 15 years, we've seen an increased incidence of approximately A, 10%, B, 25%, and C, 50%. C? Yeah. 50. Unfortunately. And does anyone else want a prize and answer the 6 questions? Yeah. Well, I guess you can be the next nominated. Disruption of the ecosystems is threatening the survival of the species. The consequences of this are fantastic, because we won't suffer mosquito bites anymore. B, okay, because the fittest species will always survive. Or C, catastrophic, because we risk losing up to 1 million species. Unfortunately, they're not very like...
Everyone's been listening.
It's great, you've all been listening. It's not always a fun answer though. So I'll give you that. Yeah.
All right. Everybody with us so far? Okay? All right? Oh, in the third and closing round of the presentation, another 25 minutes to go, and then we'll be able to hand it over to questions and discussion. Right, so I think so far what we've tried to cover is a little bit about climate science, what causes it, and what are the impacts. The next thing is, well, what's the state of the world? How's the world responding to this? And what are the solutions at hand? So let's have a look first at who are the major offenders. And this is pretty current data. And China is way out there with about 30% of the global emissions population of 1.3 billion people now. United States are there at 16%, India 7% and Russia 5%. So these countries make up in excess of 50% of the total global emissions. So we rely on these countries for taking serious and real action to address climate change. We'll come back a little bit later and talk about what they are doing. But a little bit of a sneak preview on that one. China and India are the most progressive countries in terms of action on climate change, the most progressive countries of all. The other important thing about this graph is the other 50% is made up of a heap of countries. They're made up of about 180 countries, and they all have very small contributions individually. But there is no excuse for any one country for stepping outside of their obligation to address climate change. If one country stepped out, then the rationale would allow all of the other countries to step out as well, and we would have no progress on climate change. So this argument that's put forward about, oh, we're only 1.3% of global emissions carries no water whatsoever. And in Australia's case, whilst we're small in total, in terms of per capita, and we're only a country of just over 20 million people, our emissions per capita are one of the highest in the world, certainly even ahead of the United States. There's a reason for that, and that is because we are a fossil fuel-based economy in terms of the generation of our electricity is fossil fuel-based. And that's why we have a very big emission. But that means that we have a much bigger job to do than other countries in relation to getting our emissions down in relation to our per capita contribution. The trajectory shown here is the trajectory as to what we would need to get to hit net zero emissions. So let's talk about Paris a little bit. Back in 2015, 186 countries met in Paris for what was called the Conference of the Parties 21. And the agreement at that conference was that the world agreed that we needed to keep the increase of temperature to below 2 degrees, with a preference for 1.5 degrees. That should be the target, but it has to be below 2. I mean, 2 is not without problems, but it was considered a realistic target. And to achieve that, the world had to get on a trajectory of having net zero emissions by 2050. So whilst we still may be emitting carbon dioxide, we've got other activities on Earth, such as the growing of the forests, to absorb more carbon dioxide. That was the key outcome of COP21 in 2015, and also an agreement that developing countries who haven't contributed at all really to this problem that the Western countries have. In fact, the OECD 20 are about 85% of global emissions, 85% from the OECD 20. The richest countries in the world have caused the problem. And so it was agreed that the developing countries would be supported by the wealthy countries in their transition. So this is where we're at globally now. This is the sort of trajectory we're on. If we didn't do anything, by 2100 we'd have a temperature increase of about 4.1 to 4.8 degrees. which is a doubling or even potentially a tripling in the amount of CO2 which is being emitted into the atmosphere, from 50 to 100 or 150. In fact, interestingly today, I don't know if you saw it in the newspaper, the report released stating that the fossil fuel industry globally is investing and producing fossil fuels at a rate that will take us somewhere in line with this, but by 2030. That their projection of increased production would set us, if that was consumed, would set us on, would keep us on this path here. So the fossil fuel industry is certainly backing themselves in and nothing's going to be done. Based on current policies, we would, if those policies were delivered, we'd be around about 3. Based on the pledges, we'd be less than 3. But this is where we need to get to be at 2 degrees or even 1.5. This is the path we're on. This is the path we need to follow. I mean, it's a huge gap. And we can't underestimate the scale of the task ahead of us to reverse the trajectory that we're currently on. So what's Australia saying? Well, when Australia went to COP21, and it was the time of the Abbott government, with a commitment that we would reduce our emissions by 26 to 28%. And there was a lot of debate, a lot of dejection about what should our targets be. Interestingly, the government created a Climate Change Authority at the time, 2014, earlier by the Rudd government. The Climate Change Authority, the expert opinion of the government said 45% reduction by 2030. The Abbott government at the time said, no, we're not going to do 45, we're going to do 26. And they said we would get there by creating an emissions reduction fund. Emissions reduction fund is giving money to industry to reduce their emissions, essentially. So it's a government-funded fund rather than a market-based fund. We also had, established by the Rudd government, a renewable energy target whereby 20% of electricity had to be generated by renewable energy sources. Now this has been a very successful policy because we've actually exceeded that target. We're at about 22% today, and we're on a trajectory. If we continue investment, this is the question, well, if we continue investment, we could be on about 40% by 2030, 40% of electricity generated by renewable energy sources in Australia. Problem is that this renewable energy target has not been replaced with anything. There is no yet target. I mean, we've heard all of it. Everyone's aware of all the kerfuffle of the previous government with trying to introduce the NEG, the National Energy Guarantee. It was a complete failure, a complete flop. Turnbull lost his job. And consequently, we don't have any policy to replace this. There's also support being provided through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, whereby government money is being invested to support clean energy investments by private industry. A company I'm associated with was actually a beneficiary of that, where they invested in an energy management software company. And also grants that have been provided through the Australian Renewable Energy Authority. So there are things happening. So what's the result of all of that? Well, unfortunately, we are nowhere near on track to meet our Paris targets. Now, you will hear the government say that we will meet our Paris targets in a canter, which is absolute rubbish. To quote Scott Morrison, we will meet our targets in a canter. Because what he's backing in is the fact that the prior policy, which was called the Kyoto target, which expired in 2012, under the Kyoto target, Australia was given a licence to increase their emissions, not to reduce them, to actually increase their emissions. And we beat it. We beat it by about 350 gigatonne. And so Morrison's saying, okay, we're going to take that 350 and we're going to apply it to the future reduction. It's called the carryover credits. And therefore our obligation is nowhere near what would otherwise be. The UN Climate Conference this year, which the PM chose not to attend, ranked Australia 55th out of 60 in terms of their policies and their progress in terms of climate change. So we have a lot of work to do. I mean, we're in good company. The US was ranked 59 out of 60, by the way, as a result of the policies of the Trump government and their withdrawal from the Paris Accord. So this is where we're at. We're here. We're emitting about 550 million tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. It's been stable over the last few years, and the major reason it's been stable is because of electricity generation converting to renewable sources. Other sources have gone up, but CO2 emissions from electricity generation have actually gone down and have kept us at a reasonably stable level. But this is where we need to go to. If we're even going to meet this 26 or 28% target, this is where we need to go to. And we're not on track to do that. Nothing is happening that's going to get us there. This is about a 10% reduction every year if we're going to hit this target. This is the real target, not the PM's target, by the way. It's ignoring. You can see the impact of 300. If it's 700 to hit the real target, he's actually saying it's only 350 because he's using these Kyoto credits carryover. We have a lot of work to do. So, reflecting where we were on that trajectory, with the current policy suggesting 3 to 4 degrees increase, what would that mean? What would life on Earth look like if we actually experienced a 3 to 4 degree increase in temperature? Well, there wouldn't be any coral. Coral would disappear completely. Consequently, the 30% of fish species that Chloe mentioned won't survive. 40 to 70% of species will be extinct. And, scientists expect that with that and the extinction of insects, humans would follow about 500 years later. There'd be massive water stress due to drought and shrunk glaciers. Land-based glaciers are important also because they provide the irrigation for many communities to water their agriculture in summer. Many communities around the world. Sea level rise of between 1 and 6 metres, and probably, I don't know how do you rate these things, but the big thing being this mass migration, these climate refugees that the Lancet has spoken about as a consequence of as people move due to food scarcity and uninhabitable land. So given all of this, this evidence and this reality that we're experiencing today, so why is there denialism? Why are we still hearing, doubts about climate change? Well, we're maybe hearing it from one source, and that's from the media, particularly the media owned by Murdoch with News Corporation in Australia, Sky News, and Fox News in the US. Because media is, this particular media is giving a lot of airplay to the opposite argument. We saw earlier it's 97% versus 3%. Well, if you look at the Murdoch media, it's about, the majority would be about climate science denialism rather than supporting climate science. And the media is also representing people who support them as well, and we'll come to that. Wealthy vested interests, predominantly in the fossil fuel industry, and I'll quantify the interests of the fossil fuel industry. They're funding think tanks around the world in big numbers, which I'll also come to. Mainly right-wing think tanks. The Heartland Institute in the US is the major. In Australia, the major one is the Institute of Public Affairs, the IPA, who are active in publishing and preparing material against climate science and action on climate science. Just today there's been a report issued, a YouTube video issued by the IPA, funded by Gina Reinhardt as interests. Conservative ideology. Now the reality is that if we're going to do something about climate change, it challenges conservative ideology. Conservative ideology basically being the right and freedom of markets to operate freely. Free enterprise, unregulated by government, low taxes, no government interference. That's the essential essence of conservative ideology. And action on climate change challenges that. To the extent that conservative interests and conservative media are very vocal in actively promoting a view that action on climate change is a socialism conspiracy. It's anti-capitalism, and it's aimed at redistribution of wealth. And you can hear that frequently in the media. You can hear that frequently from our politicians as well. Just listen to a few words of Craig Kelly, for example. And the other one is just an inconvenient truth. I mean, denialism's easy. Oh, that's bullshit. It's just natural variability. Get out of the way. That's much easier to say than saying, yes, it's a problem, it's an issue, we need to do something about this, and I accept my responsibility in the context of this, and we need to take action. That's a much harder thing to say. So these vested interests, Gina Reinhardt is a classic, but just represents the fossil fuel industries. We've dealt with one of these problems already, fortunately, the last election, but there are still many in the government that have that view. And of course the media interests in Rupert Murdoch. And why are the fossil fuel industry so vigorous in their investment, their campaigning against action on climate change? Well, have a look at these statistics. Since 1850, we've burnt nearly 2,000 gigatons of fossil fuels. That's what we've emitted into the atmosphere. Frighteningly, about half of that has happened since 1950. You saw the graph. Half of that has happened since 1950. This amount has happened since 2000. This is how much we've got left in terms of gas, coal and oil still in the ground. We've got 3,000 gigatons, 50% more than what we've burnt already. And of course, this is resources that can't be burnt. If we are to keep within our 2-degree target, this is all we can afford to burn, a very small portion. This needs to stay, sorry about that, wrong button. This needs to stay in the ground. The orange needs to stay in the ground. And the market value of what needs to stay in the ground is $22 trillion. And you wonder why the vested interests aren't spending a shitload of money on campaigning against action on climate change. In the US, $1 billion is spent every year in funding right-wing think tanks against climate science. And if you look at the rhetoric and if you read it and you get behind it, you'll understand that this is no longer a scientific debate, because there isn't a scientific argument. It is purely a political debate. It's a political debate about what sort of world we want to live in and what the world would be if we took action versus what the world would be if we didn't take action. It's a political debate. And of course we can trust these vested interests because they're always looking after our best interests, as the tobacco industry did in the 60s and the 70s with their vigorous campaign, claiming not only wasn't smoking bad for you, it was actually good for you. And 20,000 physicians agreed it protected your throat. But let's get on to some more positive news now, if I haven't already scared the shit out of me, because it scares the shit out of me. Some of the positive news. And we're hearing sentiment from quarters we wouldn't have expected to hear from. Did I miss one? I think I might have missed one. Yeah, I did. The BP's chief economist, Spencer Dale, recently said, there's no doubt about climate science. We've got to take actions. We've got to get ourselves on a path of net zero emissions by 2050. This is the BP chief economist. Ian Dunlop, former Shell chief executive, or not chief executive, but former executive and chairman of the Australian Coal Association, says that climate change is an existential threat to human civilization as we know it. Pretty powerful words. Most recently, the Reserve Bank of Australia issued a report and said that all of the consequences of climate change will create both financial and economic risks. The financial community is getting on board, and that includes Goldman Sachs, one of the world's largest investment banks. Goldman Sachs says the consequences of climate change will cause significant risks to the world's largest cities. And by that, it means both in terms of economic risks as well as physical asset risks. This was just released in September 2019. The Actuaries Institute, representing the insurance industry of Australia, or those people who work in the insurance industry of Australia, has said that tens of thousands of dollars will be wiped off superannuation balances as a consequence of climate change, and make life for those over 60 more likely to die from heat stress. Now, of course, that will probably be in countries that don't have the comfort of air conditioning to be able to resort to, but there's a lot of people in Australia who are vulnerable without the comfort of air conditioning, of course, which generates CO2 if it's not from renewable sources. But the reality is, as we age, our ability to deal with heat weakens, and therefore the chance of dying from heat stress increases. So must we change? Of course we must change. This is, there is no question about this. We have to take action. And so let's talk about now some of the positive things that is being done, has been done, and needs to be done in the future to address this issue. Firstly, let's look at the global wind energy capacity worldwide. This has seen a phenomenal acceleration in deployment around the world. Just in the last 20 years, we've seen this massive growth in the deployment of wind energy, which is incredibly exciting. It's supported by the demand for renewable energy, as well as continuing cost reduction in wind capacity. In fact, it's been calculated that if wind was fully deployed around the world, it would be able to meet our electricity needs of the world 40 times over. Now, of course, it's the question of where that wind is and where the demand is, but nevertheless, it's an interesting metric to contemplate. Countries around the world are now generating more electricity from renewable power than they're generating from coal. In Germany, in 2018, did it. In England, in March, 3 times as much energy generated from wind than from coal. In Portugal, 100% of its electricity came from renewable sources in March 2018. These are just a few of the examples. I could go on with many, many more of these examples if we had the time. So wind's a great story. It's a great story in Australia. Again, the same incredible acceleration in the deployment of wind farms in Australia, which is exciting. And we see these farms dotted all over the country where the wind blows. Where the wind doesn't blow, the beautiful thing is we can have solar. So let's come to solar. Before we do that, Bloomberg New Energy Finance has said that 2/3 of the world's population now are living in countries where new energy, not existing, but new energy from renewable sources, being wind and solar, is cheaper than new energy from coal or oil or gas and nuclear. Nuclear is nice because it doesn't emit CO2, but it's very, very expensive. 2/3 of the world population are in that position. Australia is one of those, is part of that. You don't see new coal in Australia because renewable is cheaper. You'll only see new coal in Australia if the government yields to the fossil fuel industry and subsidises the building of a new coal-fired plant. Wind and solar are cheaper in Australia. Solar PV installations, so this includes both rooftop solar as well as solar farms. And over time, solar farms will become much more significant than rooftop solar. Australia's solar PV capacity has exploded also. And these are the projects that are on foot at the moment. These are underway, these projects. There's 6,500 megawatts of renewable energy projects on the books right now, in addition to what has already been invested in renewable energy. And so long as we the government maintains a target to increase uses of renewable energy, this investment will continue. But it is reaching a hiatus. The investment in renewable energy is slowing down. This will continue, but it is slowing down. This, as a metric, what does 6,500 megawatts mean? Well, that's about 10% of the total electricity this country consumes every year. So. And this is in addition to what's already there. So we can easily get there if we have the right government incentives to support it. The cost of solar has just crashed, and the viability of building solar farms has gone from $80 a watt to now 25 cents a watt. And 2 million homes in Australia now have solar panels on their rooftops. That's more than 1 in 5 houses. So what are the other countries around the world doing? Let's have a look at the investments that have been made in new electricity. And as I mentioned, the countries like China are actually leading the way. They are investing more in renewable energy than they're investing in coal. That was the statistics in 2018. Same in India. Majority of investments in new energy was in renewable energy. In Europe, well, let me have a look at the statistics. 88% was in renewable energy, new investment. Now, coal-fired power plants have a limited life, about 50 years, so eventually they have to be replaced. They wear out, they break down, become unreliable, and they have to be replaced. They are not being replaced by other coal-fired plants in the world today. They're being replaced by renewable. The US is a bit of a laggard here as a result of the explosion in natural gas resources, unconventional gas, through fracturing of gas in the US. has made gas very, very cheap in the US, and as a consequence, the rollout there hasn't been as great as it has in other countries. But coal is on the decline, and here's the graph which is showing it. Now, the big game changer in renewable energy is storage, the ability to store the energy when it's being generated and we don't need it. If you look at the profile of demand of a household in Australia, for example, our demand is between about 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock during the day, 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. Peak generation of solar is around about 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So we're generating electricity from solar without actually consuming it. So we need to be able to store it. That also applies at grid level. We want to be able to store energy at grid level as well. We can do it through lithium-ion batteries. We can do it through other sources, such as pumped hydro being another very effective means of storing power. Pumped hydro being when you don't need the energy, you use it to pump it up the hill, and then when you do need it, you pump the water up the hill. When you do need it, the water comes down the hill, and that's what Snowy 2.0 is, a pumped hydro story. The other big game changer is with the cost of storage is in electric vehicles. And we've seen the rollout of electric vehicles so far to a reasonable extent that it has an incredibly long way to go. And the game changer here will be when the cost of batteries of electric cars goes below the cost of cars powered by the internal combustion engine. It's expected, based on the rate of development so far, that's going to occur in about 2022, 2023. So if you're buying an internal combustion engine car today, and you're going to keep it, say, for 5 years, think about it, because the resale value on that car there's a good chance it's going to be a lot less than what it would be once this tipping point is reached in 2023. Even General Motors said in 2017 that the future is all electric. So this is really good news. It's not the whole story. I mean, the answer is not there completely. A lot more work to be done, but it's great progress. And what's really important is that we can't afford to be despondent in this process. We need to be positive about what we can achieve, because despondency is no better than denialism. It means you don't do anything. And we need to be active. We need to be confident that that we can actually make a change in this world, in spite of the complexity and the diversity of the problems. Sustainable living is achievable, but it does require significant changes to the way we live. Electric cars instead of internal combustion cars, for example. It requires we need to have a rollout of charging stations in the country as well. But we have proven to be incredibly innovative species. The technological transformations that we have made just in our lifetimes have been phenomenal. Through satellite technology, space technology, the internet, mobile technology. I mean, all of these things have already changed the way we live in a very, very short space of time. So we have the innovation and the intelligence and the capability to make those changes. So I believe that a transformation to clean energy can and will happen, so long as we are all, as a community and as a society, committed to that change. Technology will continue to improve. It is evolving. The people of the world are demanding it, and we're hearing it in the streets. Economics is making it viable. I mean, we're not talking about having a substantial drop in our standard of living or way of life to be able to achieve this. Economics is making this viable. It's making sense because renewables is getting cheaper than other forms of energy, for example. And the future of the world does depend on that transformation. And Chloe, just to have another word before we wrap up.
So we see pictures like this and images and footage of lots of protests going on at the moment. And climate activism has become more prevalent because our governments are not listening. We have kids, adults, elderly, and everyone in between on the streets protesting for the fate of our future. It is us, the youth, who are voicing this injustice. Decisions are being made and the future controlled by those of an age who will not be around to experience the consequences. Climate change shouldn't be a matter of politics. Whether you're a Labor, Liberal or Greens voter, this will affect everyone's future. Now's the time, I think, as a lot of us do, is to look beyond the next election cycle and govern for the long-term future, the health of our planet and of all of us there.